session. So please remain in Chatham House rules. This will be shared for those that have been unable to join us for whatever reason this morning, but please just be aware we are recording. So just to quickly outline the session, as you'll have seen in the run-up to this, we'll first be hearing from one of Make UK's health and safety experts on mental health awareness, mental health first aiders and stress management. Then we'll move on to hear from Westfield Health and their Director of Wellbeing, Richard, who will be talking about leadership of organisations and what they're seeing in the market, and they've actually just released a report on coping with COVID-19 and all things related to mental health as well. Then we'll have a quick poll just to get a bit of feedback from you and what's happening in your businesses. Then we'll move on to hear from a specific guest speaker, one of our members at Harris UK. They'll be talking about what they've been doing in their workplace. And then towards the end, we'll hear from one of our HR experts at Make UK on managing mental health in the context of working from home and remote working arrangements. And then there'll still be time to ask questions throughout the session, but there will be an allotted time at the end to revisit some of these things as well. I do know we've still got people joining us, so welcome to any late arrivals, but I would like to start things off by going to Peter Thorpe, as I said, is one of our health and safety consultants at Make UK. And if you wanted to share your screen and take things away for us, Peter.
Okay, so hopefully you can see my my screen there. Yeah, just by way of a sort of quick introduction, I'm a health and safety consultant with the organisation. Been with the business now for about 15 years or so. And my time is kind of split between delivering training and also delivering sort of consultancy and health and safety support for member organisations. Been spending quite a lot of time over the last sort of year or so delivering sort of mental health awareness courses for various organisations. So I think it has become very high focus. I think historically relatively high focus, but I think with COVID-19 and the sort of pandemic, I think it's had increased focus within lots of organisations. So really, what I wanted to do in this session is to, I suppose, firstly kind of set the scene. So looking at focus on mental health within workplaces, some of the key statistics from the HSE, but then spending a little bit of time talking about some of the underpinning legislation and what the law requires us to do, and what the law requires us to think about with regard to mental health, and then kind of, I suppose, shifting the focus a little bit, looking at sort of work-related stress, looking at some of the key issues within organisations, and what can be done to manage work-related stress, with a little bit of focus there on the sort of the pandemic and some of the disruptions that are happening, which could impact on individuals. Then focusing on, sort of finishing off really, kind of looking at mental health in relation to sort of COVID-19. So just to sort of share sort of one or two sort of headline statistics in terms of maybe why it's important to focus on mental health. As you may be aware, the HSE publish health and safety statistics on an annual basis, and their 2020 statistics came out sort of relatively recently. And if we look at those particular statistics in relation to sort of ill health, then what you can see very clearly there is that stress, depression, anxiety accounts for over 50% of new and long-standing cases of work-related ill health within that 12-month period. Historically, it was musculoskeletal disorders which were the highest prevalence, but over the last few years, that's been very much overtaken by stress, depression, anxiety. And also a very significant cause of working days lost, accounting for 55% of lost days. In terms of the main industries where stress, depression, anxiety is significant, key areas: utility supply, public health and administration, and education tend to be the sort of higher areas of stress and mental health and anxiety, depression. And also it tends to be within the sort of management type roles where it's particularly prevalent. If we kind of look at again, some of the headline statistics, if we look at kind of number of workers suffering from work-related stress, anxiety, depression, then what we can see there is we've got sort of 828,000 employees who are suffering from some sort of work-related stress, depression, anxiety, either new or long-standing, accounting for just under 18 million working days lost. But if we look at the graph at the bottom, I think it's quite telling, is the kind of the rate of self-reported stress, depression, anxiety has been kind of relatively static from sort of 2001, 2002. But if you kind of look at sort of 2014, 2015 onwards, a steady incline. But then if we look at the latest statistics, 2019, 2020, a very significant increase in the rate of reported stress, depression, anxiety in the workplace. And I suppose one of the key questions there is it related to COVID-19? But I suppose when you look at when the period of time that the statistics cover, which is sort of April 19 till the end of March 2020, then really COVID-19 was just kind of very much emerging at the end of that period. And it wasn't until the sort of back end of March that we ended up going into the first lockdown. So the agency has kind of looked at this, and really what their sort of conclusion is that COVID-19 isn't the main driver in terms of those increases, although it could be a contributory factor. So I suppose the worrying thing there is if COVID-19 isn't a contributory factor, and we've seen that increase, then what's going to happen in 2020, 2021, where we now have COVID-19 lockdowns and the sort of pandemic. Looking at the causes of work-related stress, depression, anxiety, these have been kind of relatively sort of static for a number of years now. We find a way that the sort of biggest cause of work-related stress, depression, anxiety is workload. Then we have sort of lack of support, bullying, violence, changes in work patterns. But then if we look at those statistics, I suppose, compared to sort of COVID-19 and what we're going through at the minute, with furlough, working from home, social distancing, then I think, areas like changes in work patterns, but also, lack of support might be more significant moving forward. But then also, if we kind of look at those kind of working days lost, then 17.5 million working days lost in 2018, and over £20 billion in relation to the cost of presenteeism. So presenteeism, those employees who are at work, but not being productive. So more common with higher paid staff, and very much related to mental health within the workplace. And I think one of the key things about presenteeism is that with more and more people kind of working from home now, it's probably much more difficult to spot employees who are struggling, which very much emphasizes that need for sort of good communication with the workforce. But also there's lots of benefits in focusing on health, well-being, mental health within the workplace. Statistic I'm sharing there, by focusing on employee well-being can result in a significant increase in productivity. So it makes good business sense as well. Thinking about the kind of legal responsibility side of things, within the UK, obviously we have the Health and Safety at Work Act, sets broad duties, broad responsibilities for employers, employees and others. But when we talk about duty to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees, really we should be thinking about mental health as well as physical health. But then we also have the management of health and safety at work regulations, which brought in that legal requirement to risk assess. And again, when we talk about risk assessment, we should be looking at the mental health impacts that we are placing employees under, not just the sort of physical risks as well. So thinking about the psychological as well as the physical. Obviously, underpinning that, we've also got the Equality Act, and there is that requirement to or not to discriminate against anybody who has a mental health condition, and puts reasonable adjustments in place. I think one of the interesting things that's come in over the last few years, though, is with regard to first aid needs assessment. Now, under first aid at work regulations, employers have a duty to identify what first aid requirements they need to put in place for within their own organisation. And one of the things that came over the last couple of years is within the HSE guidance, a requirement to consider mental health as well under that first aid health needs assessment. So, where there is an issue, then considering training for managers, employees with regards to mental health, but also considering appointing mental health first aiders. So, first aid, considering mental health, but also an increasing area of focus within the HSE as well. If we look at work-related stress, HSE definition, adverse reaction of to excessive pressure. So it's not, stress isn't an illness, it's a state, but it can lead to other conditions such as anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, etc., etc. So it can cause longer-term health issues as well. And I think the key thing is understanding the difference between pressure and stress. Generally, pressure is good. Pressure helps us perform. But it's when that pressure becomes excessive that it starts to have negative impacts. And people can work for a period of time under high levels of pressure, but when it becomes the norm, then it starts to have a very negative effect in terms of people's mental and physical health as well. So it's considering that level of pressure and make sure that that level of pressure doesn't become excessive. And again, because of the pandemic, because we've got lots of people home working, maybe a lot more difficult to identify where employees are suffering from excessive pressure. The HSE have kind of been focusing on work-related stress for a number of years now. And one of the things that they developed is their stress management standards. And essentially, this is kind of seen as the gold standard, if you like, for managing stress within the workplace. And it's all based around the risk assessment approach, identifying those situations where people might be under undue stress or undue pressure, and identifying what can be done to effectively manage and reduce the levels of stress that people are exposed to. And one of the things that they identified within those stress management standards is, I suppose, six key stressors that are a sort of main area of focus. Demand, control, support, relationships, role, and also organizational change. So if as an organization you want to kind of focus on work-related stress within the business, then one of the best ways, I think, of doing that is to focus on these key stressors and identify where those may be present within your business. But certainly with COVID-19 and the sort of current pandemic, I think potentially an increased focus on demands, people's workload, working patterns, working environments are changing in terms of more people working from home, but also difficult for organisations to provide support to their employees, particularly where they're working from home or they're on furlough. And also lots of organizations going through organizational change. And if we don't manage that effectively, then potentially it's going to increase the potential for work-related stress. Lots of guidance, lots of tools that the HSE have developed to help organizations to focus on work-related stress. The first one is the Management Standards Indicator tool. So essentially that's a questionnaire that can be used within your organization, focused on the management standards to identify where the key stresses are within your organization. Because if you don't know what they are, then you can't deal with them, you can't manage them. But also managers can have a huge role to play in terms of, I suppose, creating stress within workplaces, but also identifying and managing stress. So the Management Competency Indicator tool essentially is a sort of self-help guide for managers, again, based on a questionnaire, to help them to look at their own behaviors and how they can impact on work-related stress. There's also the HSE guidance, using the management standards approach, and they've also developed a stress talking toolkit as well. And the reason why they've done that is because quite often one of the most difficult things is entering into conversations with individuals with regards to stress. So the stress talking toolkit provides a little bit of a guide for managers in terms of how they can start those potentially difficult conversations. So lots of useful information there on the HSE website, but also if you want to sort of talk to us, we can sort of guide you in the sort of right direction. If we kind of focus now more specifically on sort of mental health and COVID-19, then I suppose if we look at the stresses associated with the pandemic, we've got lots of employees on furlough, concerns over job security, but also lots of new ways of working, home working that we talked about earlier, but also the new norm within the workplace in terms of social distancing. And that can cause lots of pressures on employees. But also concerns about contracting COVID-19 as well, particularly if they have relatives or if they have dependents who are sort of clinically vulnerable. And outside of work, it can also have a huge impact on day-to-day life. So I suppose in terms of what we can do as employers, really a lot of it is about communication. Making sure that we keep our employees informed about what's going on, particularly those that are on furlough or home working. But also considering those employees who maybe are about to return to the workplace, who may have been absent either on furlough or isolating for a significant period of time, because the new norm is going to look very strange and they may be very nervous about coming back. But also training managers and employees to look for the signs where people are struggling with their mental health, and encouraging employees to come forward as well and making it easy to do that. But also lots of other businesses as well, looking at introducing employee assistance programs, sort of anonymous helplines, things like that, that employees can contact. But then also going back to the first aid side of things, considering whether it might be beneficial to train and appoint mental health first aiders as a first point of contact for employees who might be suffering from either stress or any other mental health condition. But lots of things that employees can do themselves as well. Limit your time spent watching the news. I think one of my favorite words or phrases from this year is doom scrolling. So constantly checking the internet, reading depressing news. So, if we can minimize the amount of doom scrolling, then that can have a positive impact on people's mental health. Then also encouraging exercise, fresh air. Lots of evidence that exercise can reduce depression in individuals who are suffering from depression. Healthy eating and maintaining that good work-life balance. Again, something that is quite easy to slip, particularly if you have people who are working from home. And then also make sure that employees keep in touch with family, friends, colleagues. We talk a lot about social distancing, but really it's physical distancing that we need to focus on. We need to keep that social side of things going. whether it be through sort of Zoom calls, FaceTime, Teams calls, whatever that might be. Keep those connections there so people don't feel isolated. Just kind of finishing off very briefly in terms of the support that we can provide, in terms of training, number of training courses that we've developed with regard to things like mental health awareness, stress management, but also mental health first aider courses as well. And all of those can be delivered on the or on our virtual classroom platform quite easily. So that just kind of, I suppose, sets the scene a little bit in terms of where we are about stress, mental health from a health and safety viewpoint. So what I'm going to do now is hand back to Matthew.
I'll need milk for the rest of the drinks.
You got me there?
Thank you very much, Peter. And that's, as you say, a really good overview of what people need to be considering right now, but also where we're at, and kind of that rise in cases is quite worrying, considering the stats where aren't yet for this year.
Absolutely,
but,
yeah.
Just to reiterate to anyone that's joined us a little bit late, we will be sharing the material that's presented, and also a recording post-event as well. Thank you very much to popping in the HSE links within the chat. That's great. We have had one or two questions very quickly for you, Peter. Yep. One I just had, and I've actually done this personally with Make UK. Has the employer the obligation to conduct risk assessments to everyone? The context being those who are working from home in remote arrangements at the moment, they are not contractually a home worker. Is the employer obliged to still carry out a risk assessment for that individual?
Yes, because they are doing work for the employer. So I think the key thing there is that there are lots of things that the employee can control in terms of risks. So that they're in control of their own home, if you like. But where employees are being asked to use computers, DSA work, that type of thing, then yes, that needs to be looked at. It needs to be assessed. So yes, there is still that requirement.
Super. Hopefully some good guidance for you there, Irene. And we've just had a question in from Geraldine at CBM. Peter, do you think it will become mandatory to have a mental health first aider?
I would say not. I think it very much depends on your organisation. So I can't see it as becoming mandatory, but I think in lots of organisations it can be seen as being beneficial. It's really all down to the risk assessment process. So it's down to employers to decide whether it be beneficial for them as a business. So I can't ever see it becoming mandatory, to be honest. No.
Super, thanks, Peter. And we will come back to questions at the end, but there are a couple of things we've had in at this time. Peter, it'd be absolutely great if you could pop in a link to some of the resources at the HSE that you referred to in the chat, and then
yes, certainly,
on the call can take that away. Brilliant.
No problem at all.
So moving on, we're delighted also to be joined this morning by Richard Holmes, who is the Director of Wellbeing at one of Make UK's partners, Westfield Health, who are experts in dealing with employers on their health and wellbeing with their staff. So it's actually very timely that we're joined by Richard, as they just released a piece of research called Coping with COVID, which talks about workplaces across all sectors. And I'll come on to what they're doing, looking at manufacturing just towards the end of this. But we'll kind of run this and kind of find out a few more key insights into that research with Richard. So can you tell us a little bit more about that research and what you've been doing in the last year with regards to some of the things we've already discussed this morning?
Certainly, Chris, and good morning, everyone. In relation to the Coping with COVID report, which is the piece of research we've just concluded, that talked to a representative sample of 1,600 people, both employees and HR professionals, and talked about the impact COVID has had on their well-being and particularly their mental health. Now, as a well-being company, we recognise that if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that things are rarely straightforward, and our recovery as businesses, whether that's economic, social, physical, mental, isn't going to be simple. It isn't going to be linear. So given we're almost a year into the pandemic, we wanted to assess the impact on the nation's mental health, assess the potential costs to business, and start to highlight areas that we might, as businesses, need to focus on for our businesses to recover as quickly and as effectively as we can.
And within the report, what does it tell us about the pandemic and the toll and the impact that we're having, or it's having, on people like ourselves and staff as well?
Well, I don't think it'd be any surprise to anyone on this call. Yeah, we've all personally witnessed it, and our businesses have witnessed it. It's had a huge impact, hasn't it? And a number of observers are almost referring to it as a second pandemic running alongside COVID. Now, in terms of this particular research, we found that over 1 in 3 people said their mental health wasn't good, and almost 50% said their mental health had got worse over the pandemic. Now, we all know that mental health was a big issue before the pandemic, and Chris highlighted that significant rise in 1920, just before the pandemic hit. So we need to remember we were on the back foot in relation to mental health when the pandemic started, and this past year's just causing even greater problems than we had before.
And working with businesses up and down the country, what are the kind of things that you're hearing that employees are struggling with?
Well, it's mixed, based upon whether employees are working from home, whether they're still in the workplace, as will be the case with a number of people's organisations that are on this call at the moment. So for those of us working from home, I'm sure everybody on this call will recognise some of the challenges we've faced. You know, when we work from home, we tend to work longer hours. That's just a fact. We found that with people that were working from home before the pandemic happened. We're finding it more difficult now to separate work and home life. And a lot of us working from home are missing the social side of work, which is really, really important to our well-being. Those for us going into work, well, we've got the challenges that we're concerned about our health, both in the workplace and also about how we get to work safely. So they were key issues coming out, as was work itself. So work's seems to be causing quite a bit of worry at the moment. The report revealed 3 top causes in relation to this. Generally feeling anxious about work, worrying about losing our jobs, and concern about our health as a result of work. So these report results weren't necessarily a surprise to us, because we've seen, same as you, Chris, a large demand from employers for sort of educational webinars, support information on exactly these types of topics.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I guess what we're trying to cover so far is really looking at the individual side of things, but what impact is it having on business? Of course, rely on their teams and staff to keep things running. Yeah,
well, Peter mentioned some big figures and big stats in his piece, but the headline stats from this piece of research were there seems to be a 10% increase in mental health related absence during the pandemic. And mental health related absence appears to be costing the economy as a whole something like £14 billion a year. Now, given that sort of data that we got was self-reported, the full extent of mental health issues is unlikely to be reflected in the company's payroll reports. Yeah. Now that's the visible impact, but what about the invisible impact of lost productivity? And again, this was mentioned earlier. So in the piece of research we did, we found that 1 in 3 people were saying their mental health has affected their productivity on a weekly basis. That feels like a big hit to me. And I'm sure everyone on this call, that's something we can all probably relate to. We've all felt that. I've, especially on occasion, felt that impact on my motivation to actually get things done. And again, this supports something Chris was saying in terms of his research about the 20 billion cost of presenteeism, because presenteeism is usually driven by or strongly related to mental health issues in the workplace. whether you're working at home or whether you're actually in the workplace. So that gives us a flavour for the size of impact. Peter also referred to it, but it also highlights the need for employers to invest in solutions so their businesses can recover as quickly as possible.
No, absolutely, and that's something we see from our members as well. What kind of things are employers investing in then from your perspective? I mean, we're trying to raise awareness and provide guidance through webinars like this, but you mentioned kind of investing in solutions really. What's been available and what's worked well with businesses you work with?
Well, out of the research, we found 84% of HR leaders said well-being is becoming more important to their business, with 81% saying they've actually increased their well-being spend due to the pandemic. So that gives you a flavour of that side of things going. But what are they spending that money on? What can employers do to help staff? I think was your key question. Well, every organisation obviously is different, and each organisation's got different challenges. So as a director of wellbeing, what I'd say is the first step is talk to your people, find out what would benefit them most, and then introduce and monitor the impact of those initiatives. Now, for these initiatives to be fully effective, it's critical to prioritise wellbeing at a leadership level, seeing it as a business investment, not an expense. I guess simply put, taking a position stand that your organisation's wealth is going to be driven by your people's health. Now, as I mentioned earlier, employees are looking to their employers for support. Over a quarter of employees were saying that they want more support for both their mental health and physical health. So there's lots of things we can do to support our people, which in turn will help us support our own business. You asked for a simple, low-cost initiative. Well, we found a good example without getting into sales mode, but our health cash plan that we provide through you guys, Mate UK, gives employees cash towards a range of physical and mental health needs and access to 24/7 doctor line. We also found out from a survey of customers that are using company-sponsored health cash plan schemes that over 3/4 felt that allowed their employer to show that they cared about them, and they actually as an individual felt more satisfied, loyal and motivated to work because of that type of benefit provision focused on their well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you mentioned the cash plan very recently. We actually use this as an organisation at Make UK, and it's super easy to use. I use it for dental treatment. You just photograph the receipt and the reclamation payment is in your account a few days later. So yeah, I mean, I personally used it. I think one question would come through that's very much in line with this. We talk about support externally. One question just come through in the chat that says something around what can we do to change the attitudes of employers and probably managers as well towards showing how mental health is so important for their businesses. What have you kind of heard that the businesses are doing to change that dial?
Yeah, the key thing from our perspective is we're finding more and more organisations are recognising that the culture of an organisation is critical in terms of employee well-being and tackling issues like mental health. The culture drives the environment of an organisation, which determines whether that environment is going to be supportive of and conducive to good health and well-being, not just mental health, or not. So it's actually absolutely critical that approach is driven from the top, and it's driven through all the different levels of line management. Because one of the key things we can all do in terms of supporting people's well-being is, as line managers ourselves, how do we take responsibility for supporting the teams that work for us? Yeah, quite often we'll find that line managers will say, but I'm not a well-being coach. No, we're not asking you to be a well-being coach, but your fundamental role as a line manager is to deliver the performance of your team. And if well-being is impacting on the performance of that team, then your responsibility of a line manager is to support your people in those areas in whatever way you can to then support that performance of that team.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And with businesses that you work with, who you've worked with for a long time, and maybe not just through the pandemic, what have been the things that they've done that makes them potentially a good and caring employer? What's the kind of top of their agenda being?
Well, that's really, if we look at the theme of today's session, which is mental health, a lot of organisations now, it's been mentioned earlier, are investing in mental health first aiders. They're investing in employee assistance programs and counselling services. They're quite high on the agenda. But these types of services are focused on managing the problem and the risk. Now, many businesses, in addition, are recognising the need for awareness and prevention. So we're seeing a lot of organisations looking at coaching support in terms of webinars for groups, lifestyle consultations for individuals. They've been really popular over a wide range of topics, not just mental health. And those topic areas might focus on practical support in terms of, in the current climate, either working from home or commuting safely to work, or it might be focused more in terms of well-being support in terms of people's mental, emotional, physical well-being. The other area that we've seen really gain traction, and I alluded to it in the just previously, is this idea of health leadership and supporting organisations, their line managers, in better meeting the challenges they and the teams are facing. So we're doing an awful lot of health leadership training for different levels of line management. And that comes back to what I talked about before, which is really this idea that, you know, culture is created and driven by leadership at all levels. So if we're going to address, if we're serious in our organisations about addressing well-being because of the business benefit in terms of the productivity it gives, then we've got to make a start with senior and line managers, because without them, the initiatives that we put into to employees become less effective.
And I guess, you know, you've mentioned the employee assistance program that's been available from Make UK for some time, and we've had fantastic reviews. I think we've had one in the chat and from members in my time at Make UK. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and why this is a super cost-effective and easy method for members to implement?
Yeah, well, right now everybody will recognise the rise in mental health issues that we've discussed. An employee assistance program gives businesses, should we say, at a minimum, the reassurance that they're meeting some of their duty of care to employees that Peter talked about earlier. Although I recognise that many organisations' motivation to invest in their employees' mental health through EAP type programs goes well beyond simply duty of care. Yeah. For employees, particularly at this time, EAP provides confidential support in a wide range of what I would call life matters. And the pandemic will undoubtedly have had an impact on these things, whether that's relationships, general anxiety, depression, etc. So practically, what does it offer you as an individual? Well, 24-hour advice and information helpline. And if you need extra support, then there are trained counsellors that are available to provide structured counselling sessions. So usually those structured counselling sessions provide for up to 6 sessions to deal with any one concern.
And we've had a couple of reflections in the chat, and it's really interesting to see, so thank you, around that moving that dial with individuals to talk to somebody about mental health, or to have managers to think more broadly about it. So I think we've covered that a little bit with Peter, and we'll certainly come back towards the end of the session on that. But I've personally seen your research, Richard. As I say, it's funnily and very coincidentally very timely released last week, and I'll be able to send that out to everyone on the call post this meeting. But I know you're looking at releasing a similar report focused specifically on the manufacturing sector as well.
Yeah, so that's literally hot off the press today. So we'll send it through for you to be able to issue to everyone. And that actually just looks at some of the key stats coming out from the research, and compares manufacturing to the average. And there's some quite interesting variations, actually in some ways really positive for the manufacturing industry, and in other ways less so. The other thing we're going to be doing, Chris, is this is part one, which is coping with COVID. We're then looking at a second report, which is going to be entitled Coping After COVID. So that's where we're looking at the medium to long-term impact of lost productivity and the role that well-being may or may not have in helping to bridge that gap.
Brilliant, thank you. And there'll be certainly opportunity to share that information, and I know I'll be sharing the report and findings internally at Make UK as well. But brilliant, thank you, Richard. I know this is something that you're very passionate about and very much your bread and butter for day to day, so thanks for sharing your expertise.
No, pleasure, Chris, and thanks for everyone attending today.
Super, and I think it's a really good moment at this stage to take a poll now, where I will launch on screen, and it's really good for us to get feedback on some of the things we've been talking about from members on the call. Please note that the answers to these questions are anonymous and not shared, and anyone on the call cannot see who says what, but it'd be really good to understand where mental health sits in terms of your business right now, and shape some of the conversation we'll have towards the end of the remainder of this session. But I'll be quiet for a couple of seconds while you fill this in, please. And just to answer those questions, 10 being the most highest priority your business, and 1 being more insignificant. And thank you for those in the chat. There are 9 questions. You do need to complete all of them to submit your answers. And apologies if your IT doesn't allow you to. I will talk through some of these results in just a moment to share what others are thinking and seeing on these issues. And just 10 or 15 more seconds to answer the poll, but I will talk through some of these and hopefully provide some insight from members on the call, especially if you've been unable to input your answers as well.
Chris, it's Richard here. Just while you're just finishing it up, there was a really important point from Florence in the chat, which said we need to bear in mind that managers can be struggling with their own mental well-being and therefore not able to support their teams. And that's really, really true. We should also see managers as employees first and foremost. And an important part of what we do in terms of training with line managers is actually supporting them in building their own personal resilience, on the basis that you can only get resilient teams if you've got resilient leaders. So, but a really good point. We should never forget that managers are just like the rest of everyone else on this call, which is simply employees in our own right.
Absolutely, thank you, Richard, and thanks, Florence. I did see that, and thanks for coming back, as it is a super important point to raise, and hopefully you've all been able to see that in the chat as well. But I will end the polling there and share the results, and hopefully you agree with me that some of these are really interesting. Apologies for the minor confusion with regards to the scale of 1 to 10, 10 being most important, but I think we see there as an overall picture, and the largest answer that businesses rank it is 8 out of 10 as important to the strategy of your business, and actually I think the majority sit above the 5 out of 10, so that's really interesting. Has your business seen a rise in mental health issues amongst staff? The vast majority saying yes. Are you concerned for the well-being of your organisation's home workers? Again, the vast majority saying yes. And we added these 2 questions to see if there was a difference between home workers and those who are remaining on site, so production staff or those that are managing to get into the office as well. And actually there doesn't seem much difference at all, the vast majority saying yes again. Really interestingly, going back to what Peter said at the beginning of the session around first aiders or mental health being as part of your first aider policy, completely almost split 50-50, just shy of that. So that's fascinating. And the confidence of line managers and business leaders to address some of these issues in work, and looking at that, we see that that's quite split as well. I mean, just about the majority, just about over half saying either very confident or somewhat confident, but I mean 45% saying somewhat unconfident or very unconfident, which is interesting to know as well. And Claire, who we'll come to towards the end of the session, our HR consultant who will be presenting, was really keen to understand around the relationship between employer and employee, and the level of work that she's been doing. And people are typically saying that no, there's not been a negative change, but still quite an interesting proportion saying yes. And finally, so a couple of questions around whether you're interested in how Make UK can help, but also some of the things that Richard's referred to from Westfield Health as well. So thank you very much for filling in that poll. That is absolutely fascinating. We will be able to share these results if you want post-event as well. We have had over 400 people and businesses answer, so that's great. So moving forward in terms of the session, we are really pleased to be joined by Make UK member this morning to actually explain what they've actually been doing, as much as the brilliant expertise of Richard and Peter from working with multiple businesses. We thought it would be really beneficial to hear from an actual member and what they've been doing during the pandemic. So we're joined by Harris UK, who are a manufacturer of outdoor and perimeter security solutions. I know Louise is joining us from Yorkshire this morning. So Louise, please share your screen and let us know what you've been doing within HR at Harris UK, please. Super, I can see your screen, Louise. If you wanted to, I think you might be on mute.
Hi everybody. It's the sound of the pandemic. You're on mute. So my name's Louise. I'm the HR business partner at Harris Perimeter Protection Limited in Doncaster in South Yorkshire. And as Chris has said, I'll be talking to you about some practical steps that we've actually been doing during the pandemic here at Harris. Just to give a little bit of background as to the operating environment that we're in. We are a manufacturing and we are a construction business. So we have multiple offices across the country, and we've got a diverse range of workforce. So we've got geographically dispersed workforce, and then we've also got office and home workers, and we've got factory workers, we've got field-based engineers and install teams. So we've got quite a lot, but we've had to think, how do we adapt it to each individual employee so that we capture everybody and not just a specific group. So the aim of today's presentation then is to share with you some practical ideas on managing mental health and well-being in the workplace that you can start doing today. And I think that's really important. And hopefully my view is that you will leave here the presentation today thinking, do you know what, actually, I think that would really work for our business. Now I've got a little image here that I quite like, and the idea behind this is that you can't stop it raining for your employees, but what you can do is you can offer them an umbrella to help them until the rain stops. So I just thought that was a nice little kind of image to think of. So, you know, as a business and as employers and, you know, here at Harris, we're aiming to be an employer of choice. we understand that we can't fix everything, but what we can do is do best practice and really show that we care about our employees. So the first slide then is training line managers. So obviously, as a HR team, there's 5 of us in the UK, but we do heavily rely on our line managers to have a certain level of knowledge in order to identify when an employee might be experiencing a dip in their mental health, for example. So some of the points that I put here then is to train line managers, make sure that they're aware of the importance of building great relationships with their staff. And not showing favouritism, for example, because the more that they know and understand their staff, the more likely they are to be able to identify when something might not be quite right. Also, to encourage managers to have regular check-ins with their direct reports. To many of you, that might seem simple, but it might not always be the case. We've recently done at Harris some training on mental health, and as part of that, there was a section that went into identifying the warning signs of when an employee might be experiencing a dip in their mental health. So, for example, a drop in their productivity, they seem really fatigued and tired all the time. So I think if you train your line managers to identify those warning signs, then that's a massive step in the right direction. And also in that training, we covered how to have difficult conversations with staff. So managers may not feel comfortable approaching certain subjects. So it's all about empowering line managers and giving them the confidence that they feel able to call an employee or to take them to one side and have a quiet conversation and say, look, I've noticed recently that, normally your work is outstanding and I've noticed a little bit of a drop. I just wanted to have a check-in. Are you okay? So I think if managers are equipped to have those conversations, again, like with identifying warning signs, that's a real positive step. And also making sure that managers are aware of the support options. So it's about directing. So as we identified at the beginning of the presentation, we can't solve everything. We're not GPs, we're not mental health experts, but it's making sure that your management population is aware of the support options. So encourage the employees to see their GP, to call up the employee assistance programme, offer assistance of one of the mental health first aiders. Also, what to do if an employee is a danger to themselves or others. Now, hopefully this won't be something that's any of us experience too regularly, but I think if it were to happen, again, this is something that we covered at Harris on the recent training on mental health, is what do you do if you think that an employee is a danger to themselves or to somebody else? So is it a case of keeping them talking whilst you alert the police, for example? Obviously, it depends on the situation, so I think that's really important to cover. And I think Richard mentioned this earlier, we need to make sure that we get buy-in from the top to make sure that it's not just seen as lip service, basically, and that we can really show that we're changing a culture and creating a culture of where it's open communication. People, are breaking down the stigma surrounding mental health, which we all know, although I think it's reduced over the last 10 years, it certainly does still exist. So one of the steps that we've took as a HR team is doing wellbeing calls. So the point here is, if you have a HR system, some of you may be reliant on spreadsheets, for example, but at Harris, we do have a all singing, all dancing HR system. And what we've done is we've set up alerts so that we don't miss anything, because we've got quite a few employees in the UK. If an employee is put on as absent due to having bereavement leave, compassionate leave, or for a mental health reason, it flags up to the HR team, and then we would investigate, like maybe give the line manager a call and say, I've noticed that employee X has been on bereavement leave. Can you give me a little bit of information? And then from there, more likely than not, it leads to a member of the HR team calling up that employee. For example, at Harris, it might be an employee that works in our Scotland branch that's never met a member of the HR team or they've not heard from us for a while. So I think it's a really low cost as well. It just requires a little bit of time. I think that's been really well received from the Harris employees, to know that apart from the line manager, somebody in the HR team has cared enough to take time out and give them a call. What we've also recently started doing with the pandemic is the kind of, I can only put it down to a feeling or a vibe, is that the third lockdown, people are reaching breaking point. You know, the kids are being homeschooled, and I think people are getting towards the end of their tether. So what we've done is, between the HR team, we've run a report of all employees in the UK, and between us, we're making a call to them to discuss how have they been impacted by the coronavirus. Of course, a lot of that is external to work as well. Making them aware and signposting them to the mental health first aiders, the EAP, asking, is there anything as a business that we could do to support? And I think many of them, the employees that I've called, have said, no, you're doing everything that you can already. However, they appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to ask. And then, of course, I mean, it would normally fall under your long-term sick policy anyway, but making scheduled calls following long-term mental health sickness. So rather than doing the bare minimum, oh, okay, the employee's back. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Something just flashed up on the screen, that's all. So taking the time out to schedule regular calls, maybe a month or two when somebody's returned back into work, to make sure that actually everything is in a good place and you're not just making those assumptions. And as you can see there, you know, I've put a little cheesy picture on. And again, it all goes to show that you do care about your employees. Okay, so wellbeing communications, we've done quite a lot in the last year at Harris in terms of the communications that we send out to our staff. So one of the things that we've done is sending regular wellbeing communications on emails. So whether that's, we've done such a wide range. So one that's due to go out today, for example, is on 5 top tips to prevent eye strain whilst working from home, because we know that potentially people are working more from a screen. They get into bad habits working at home. I've been guilty on occasion of it, and just tips like that to take care of their well-being. We've sent Westfield Health, actually, I have sent and signposted our staff to some of the kind of hints and tips on mental health from Westfield Health as well. Even financial well-being that we've sent, and I think all well-being topics does feed into mental health, because the better that the well-being is in all areas, then the more positive that person would feel. So that's something that we've done either weekly, fortnightly, just depending on, while people are working from home, a majority, well, not a majority, but half of our workforce potentially, they've tended to be sent out on a weekly basis. As I've mentioned earlier, we do have a variety of employees, and they're not all on email, and they're not all checking emails regularly because they're field-based. So what we do have is, in our factories in Doncaster and Little Eaton, we've got TVs in the canteen area. So any communications that I send out on email, I make sure that a copy of that goes up on the screens so that the factory workers can see that. I also know that the installations team have a WhatsApp group. So I give the manager a call and say, you know, can you mention it on the WhatsApp group and get them to check their personal emails. So it's whatever works best for your business. But one of the things I'm very conscious of is I just wanted to make sure that we weren't reliant on that email culture, bearing in mind that majority of our staff, or a big portion of them, are not actually on company email addresses. I put there, use reliable sources of information. So when I'm putting these wellbeing emails together, I tend to do the majority of them. I don't just obviously all the information is not just in my mind. You know, I've got ideas for the rest of the HR team, or even some employees have given ideas on what they'd like to see in the wellbeing communications. But always use reliable sources. So I'm sure you would anyway. But I found the Mind website is really helpful. There's a lot of resources on there. And as I've also mentioned, Westfield Health. I'm a massive fan of Westfield Health. Unfortunately, we don't have it in our business, but I do have it that I pay privately for. So I'm always bigging up Westfield Health. I'm going to see my osteopath tomorrow, so Westfield will be giving me a little refund on that. So it really does help. I wouldn't be able to afford to go as often if it wasn't for that cover. A little tip there is what we did is involve our pensions provider and got some information from them in promoting financial wellbeing through pensions. We also set up some pension surgeries as well, where the opportunity was given to staff to have a one-to-one meeting with our provider or broker, and they were able to ask any questions that they've got on their pension. So, for example, you know, how much do I need to retire realistically, or whatever the questions may be. So, form a wellbeing committee. So, at Harris, we haven't yet done this, but this is one of my objectives for the beginning of this year, is to put together a wellbeing committee. And I think this goes a big way towards showing that it is part of our culture. We do want to break down the stigma around mental health, and we do want to promote positive wellbeing. So I think if you have that committee, it'll also allow you to get off the ground feedback, if you like. So having the way that I will approach it is perhaps looking at our different locations and making sure that everybody is represented and everybody feels like they have a voice to feed back into that committee. And shout about the good work that you're doing. So if I'm ever speaking to an employee, a lot of the times I'm signposting them to all the good stuff that we're doing. I do put some stuff on LinkedIn as well to say this is what we're doing at Harris. And I also use my LinkedIn sometimes to get maybe feedback or some more creative ideas to say this is what I'm working on at the moment. Can any of my network help me out in what you're doing and sharing best practice? So I've got another cheesy picture for you there. So this is some recognition ideas. Again, this is something that we haven't yet done at Harris, but it is high on my agenda. Again, one of my objectives to get these rolled out. So the ABC Awards, some of you may have heard of them, but the ABC Awards are, it stands for Above and Beyond the Call of Duty. So with COVID, many businesses, with the exception of a few, obviously cost control is high on the agenda. So as a HR professional, what I need to do and what our team needs to do is look at how can we improve the employee experience in line with keeping a tight control of costs. So the ABC Award is a really simple and effective way to recognise staff. And there's a difference between reward and recognition. So reward is more like, you know, giving you pay rises, your bonuses. This is recognising. So this does account for a lot with employees. If you show to your employees that you do appreciate them, it goes a long way. So the ABC Awards, the plan is for Harris UK, I'm contacting our marketing manager and saying, can you please, you know, get your graphic designer to put together an ABC Award so that managers, when somebody does a really good job, they can get in touch with the HR team and say, Joe Bloggs that works out of Sittingbourne, for example, has done X, Y, Z, and I think I would really like to send Joe Bloggs an ABC Award, and then we would send that out. It'll cost a little bit of management time to inform the HR team, and the cards, the ABC Awards may cost what? A piece of card. It's a really low cost option, so I'm a big fan of that. Employee of the Month. So again, many of you might already have this in place. It's not something that we've currently got in place at Harris UK, but again, it is something that we're looking to implement. And also to judge it and feed it back into the company values. This is a really good opportunity to embed your company values across the business. So ours are reliable, committed, and expert. So the idea is Employee of the Month. every month, managers would say, this is who I want to nominate. So it would come, rather than coming from employees, it would come from managers. They would say which company value they have demonstrated to an exceptional level within that month, and then it would go to the steering team to decide who was the winner that month. Time. So this is something that often can get neglected. So it's not so much an initiative, but I think it's more of an idea. Just make sure that your managers, and I know if you're anything like Harris UK, we're all exceptionally busy. You know, we've got the workload on, everybody has, but it's really important to encourage your managers and your leaders across the business to take that one-on-one time with the employees. So for example, this person here that wins Employee of the Month, you know, take the time out. So whether that's going into the canteen and sitting at opposite ends of the room having a bacon sandwich, for example, just take that time and they will really appreciate it. So this is something I've only just recently discovered. So I'm not sure if I'm just a late arrival to the kudos on LinkedIn or whether it's a new feature, but I've started seeing on LinkedIn that people give kudos to their colleagues to say you're really fun to work with, or you know, whatever it might be. So if you're not familiar with this, I'll not go into too much detail, but do a quick Google search and you'll find out how to do it. It's really simple. Again, many of our employees are not on social media, but if I think our marketing manager, for example, has done a really good job in designing these ABC awards, I might go on and give a kudos to that person. So it's just a free way of, you know, kind of recognising your staff. So I put here, share. So always share the good news. So we've got a newsletter here at Harris UK. So we recently had a couple of employees that achieved 25 years service with the business. So we want to shout about that. So it's been put on LinkedIn, it's been in the newsletter, share the good stuff in staff meetings and social media as well. And having a wall of fame. Now, obviously, any employees going on it would need to be okay with it and consent to it. But I think this is for the visual people among us. So I know I'm quite a visual person. Having that wall of fame there, whether it's a wall of fame based on your Employee of the Month, or a wall of fame, you know, you could tie it in with perhaps ABC awards, whatever works for your organisation. I think that's a really simple and, again, a low cost initiative that you can take. And I've just put a little line there to say that appreciation is key. So you can implement all the recognition schemes that you like, but you've got to make sure that you bear the end user in sight. So you could roll out Employee of the Month, but actually, you know, if it's not going to work for your organisation, it might be worthwhile choosing something different. Right, thank you, everybody. That's the end of my slot today. And then, of course, if you've got any questions, I can come back to them at the end.
Brilliant, thank you, Louise. And I did note there was some really interesting feedback, and I think I'll also use it was your analogy of the umbrella in the rain, which is a really good way of looking at it. But just conscious of the time, I think there's some fantastic feedback for you there, Louise, in the presentation, in the chat. If you could follow up with some of the questions in there, we may have time to revisit, but I'm keen to move on just because of the time.
Will do, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And so if we go to our next speaker, who is Claire Riches, who is one of our HR expert consultants at Meek UK. And I think it's fair to say, Claire, that you're better to introduce yourself as why this is such a personal and professional passion of yours to be working with employers and individuals in your own world with mental health. So you're more than welcome to share your screen and kind of introduce that background a little bit more, Claire.
Okay, so hopefully you can now see my screen okay. My apologies for not having my camera on. I live in a tiny village in a wood, and you have a choice. You can hear the voice or see the person when the network connection is low. So I thought you can hear me today. My interest in wellbeing and mental health comes from a few collective perspectives and perspectives. Firstly, as an HR professional. Secondly, as a trained counsellor and workplace mediator. My partner happens to be one of the directors for Mental Health Nursing Wales. And about 18 years ago, I suffered from anxiety and depression and had a breakdown. Looking back, there were signs. I didn't recognise them until I was too ill. So if you like, it's become a bit of my passion at the moment. So I'm going to speak to you this morning about wellbeing at home and remote working. And firstly, I just want to take the opportunity to remind you of the importance of seeking help if you need it. And please ensure that you communicate this in a regular way as part of your wellbeing messages to employees. This webinar is adapted from our suite of 5 30-minute webinars, which I developed that can be delivered in the workforce via our virtual classroom. And it's all in a preventative context where we look at what wellbeing is, wellbeing at home, remote working, wellbeing and mental health, how diet, exercise and sleep play an important part in our wellbeing, and the importance of having a work-life balance. So at the moment, COVID, lockdown, we're coping with the challenges, and many of us are, of working from home. And it's fair to say that there's been a lot of twists and turns along the way. And we were certainly wrong to imagine that the way ahead was going to be predictable. Home working and or remote working has definitely arrived for many, and may also be on the cards for quite some time, and for some it'll be a permanent arrangement. So the reality for us all is, as and when the restrictions are eased, it's going to be a long time before everything returns to the new normal. And in one sense, what I've come to realise is we are all in it together, but in another sense, the impact that it has is different for everyone. So throughout the slides, I put some tips, some comments, etc. And I talk through in the background. But the key tips are, do ensure that we keep connected. If it's digitally, then let's have our cameras on when the network allows us to. Let's take responsibility for looking after each other's well-being and mental health. And make sure we take exercise. And you can probably imagine my delight, because I live in Wales where it seems to rain an awful lot of the time. Going on the internet, I've found really good exercises that I can do indoors and sitting down. So it's great. If you want advice on coronavirus and its impact and well-being, there's a great site called Mind, and they have a short guide that's available, and it explains some of the difficulties that someone may encounter, and it's downloadable, and it's full of really helpful, insightful tips. So I do recommend that you actually go onto the Mind site. So I've included in this slide some tips to well-being and working from home. And if you have other tips, please share them with your colleagues and share them with Mate UK, so that we all get the best information that we can, because we all need support as we find our way through this. And there's some perks to working from home that some of us enjoy, by commute. But there are some downsides that we need to be able to manage. And some of the tips include setting and sticking to a routine, if your family and young children will allow, because work and personal time can get blurred when you're working from home.
Sorry, Claire, can we ask you
Claire,
to
just can you
please?
advance your slides, please, because so it's the same template. Same.
Sorry, I've got it on.
I think you're sharing the wrong screen, Claire. I think it's sharing your PowerPoint presentation and not the actual presentation when you've clicked the button.
it's supposed to show the PowerPoint presentation while I talk around it. Is that not what's happening?
It's only showing your slide 1 still from your presentation.
Right, so I've moved it now to something else.
It's
Embed
still
the
only-
7 habits. So it's
still only
frozen.
it's showing slide 1 only.
Oh,
I
okay.
think you might have shared the wrong screen. I think you've shared the actual PowerPoint and not the presentation.
Yeah, it's not the presentation screen.
Go back to plan B, shall we? Right. So talk me through, Chris. New share. Application window. I've got no sound now. Hello?
That's looking much better, Claire.
Pardon?
That's looking much better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
great,
working.
Claire.
That's working. Thank you.
Don't you just love technology? Right, now then, I've got to click share. Right.
Claire,
My screen has completely frozen and I can't hear.
Claire, can you hear me, Claire?
I can now, yes.
Chris is sharing his screen, so if you tell him which slide to go on and then tell him next slide and then he'll move it on.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's not working my end. So the slide is home working tips for well-being and mental health, which is the one I can see.
Yeah, that's on now.
Okay, I'll say next, Chris. Oh, technology, don't you love it? So yeah, where you can stick to a routine, that'll give you a structure to try and get the personal work-life balance. When you decide to stop working, turn your laptop off, shut the lid down. Unless you're expecting urgent calls, turn your mobile phone off. It's now you time. It's hard to have always a dedicated workspace, but if you do have that, just make sure everything is to hand. Next slide, please. Brilliant. So rapid technology advances, in light of my experience at the moment, has kept the physical versus the remote workplace debate in the business headlines for some time. But COVID threw it all into sharp focus, and we have made huge strides. And research has shown that there are 7 habits of successful remote managers when they're also managing their remote team. So I just wanted to share some of these thoughts with you. Firstly, managers, be flexible, have empathy. According to leading organizational psychologist Adam Grant, leadership which evidences being flexible and having empathy with your remote work staff will likely increase their productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness. Plus, it supports their mental health and well-being. Adapt your communications. Just remember that the 1960s studies actually showed that the interpretation of messages is 7% verbal, 38% vocal tone, and 55% visual body language PowerPoint. So if in effect a larger percentage is actually not the words we use, but the way we say them and our body language, when you're remotely managing your teams and it's done in the virtual world, remember those key points. Make sure that everyone has the same tools and systems to be able to do their job and to communicate. And continue to invest in your company culture and values and bring in well-being and mental health. Manage based on results rather than time spent on tasks. Remote working means that we may start earlier, we may finish earlier. It's the result that matters. As a manager and as a remote team manager, guard against overworking. It's important to maintain an understanding of how much someone is working and whether they're maintaining the work-life balance. And if you think about the earlier slide we saw about the HSE 6 pillars, work-life, home-life balance comes into that. And please, let's stay social, let's have fun. Not all meetings need to be about business-related matters. Here at Make UK, the HRC team once a week have a 30-minute coffee time meeting. It's voluntary. If you join, pop your cameras on, we share a cup of tea together and we talk about everything except work. And it keeps us as a team. Can we have the next slide, please? So I thought I would be positive, and rather than giving you a reminder of some of the typical signs and symptoms of poor mental health, I turn the tables around. These are the things to be looking for in your workforce and your remote team. Are they there? Are they being maintained? So keeping an eye on reasonable working hours, taking breaks, and not feeling guilty to have an hour's lunch. Stable moods, concentration, etc. Again, when you're spotting these signs, take care not to make generalizations or assumptions. And when in doubt, always check in with the employee. Next slide, please. Thank you. I've already spoken about communication and virtual meetings. And virtual meetings, if they don't go well, can actually reduce our well-being. They can cause us to feel stressed or anxious. So wherever possible, have your cameras on. We can see people smile. We can see them nod when we speak to them. It communicates that they may be in agreement with what we're saying. Always be prepared. Do you have an agenda before the meeting so that everybody knows what's going to be spoken about and can prepared input? When you connect with people, do you start by a general chit chat? Because when we walk into the office, we would normally have some informal chat first. Let's not lose that. Make sure that everyone has time. If you're chairing the meeting, do ensure that you ask everybody if they have any input or they have any points or other matters to raise. Remember that the virtual meeting is no different to sitting face-to-face in the office, so the same meeting rules apply. We wouldn't take a phone call in a face-to-face meeting unless we had already explained we were expecting it or it was an emergency. And therefore, let's apply these same rules and call on attendees throughout the meetings to give their thoughts and opinions. Can you have the next slide, please? So some top tips. I did quite a lot of research to find out about that. And the key feedback from research is, now that it's a virtual world, let us have an agenda so we know what's being discussed. Use the technology appropriately. Let's have captivating slides, more engagement. Keep it simple, but keep it visual and interesting. Avoid background noise, disturbances, and we've seen some wonderful examples in the news of the what not to do. Make sure that there are minimum interruptions and allow time for any other business and general chit chat. And if there are meeting notes and actions, make sure they're sent out promptly. This slide slide presentation will be shared at the end of it all. Can we have the next one, please? Chris, can we have the next slide, please?
It's just been sticky.
Technology. Whoops, no, yeah. So I spoke about remote workers, remote meetings. Just remember body language, please. I put a few images up there just to make the point. If the camera is on, it is easier for you to pick up the signs. And what I'm linking this to is the visual body reading language may help you to pick up on whether there are concerns and signs. It'll raise your awareness. Again, don't make any assumption. Speak to the employee offline on a one-to-one. But it may help you to spot if there is a decline in how they are. And I am keen to actually understand and know whether you've witnessed an increase in employee working relationship issues during these times. And the reason for that interest is during 20 and into 2021, it's been my busiest year delivering workplace mediation with individuals. So if you're able to put into the chat some information on that, it would help me very much. The next slide, please. So when we're thinking about mental health and well-being, let's seize the opportunity to improve our communication channels with remote workers. Let's be proactive. Let's actually define how we're going to maximize and benefit from clear, positive communication, and be proactive in managing. As a remote manager, it's important that you're proactive in making sure that everything runs smoothly. You also can set the standard when it comes to communicating, and make sure that when you email, read it back as though you were the recipient. And the reason for raising that is a lot of my mediation issues at the moment are around emails that are underlined, capitalized, in bold, and an employee misreading it as anger, being over assertive and critical. So before you hit the send button, just pause for a moment. If I was receiving it, how might I read it? You might want to then edit it. Encourage feedback and dialogue and discussion, and don't be tempted to micromanage. Manage individuals in the same way as you manage them as though they were face to face. And it's even more important during virtual meetings during these times to establish and maintain a positive relationship. Encourage others to speak and to talk with each other. Let them have their say. Let their voice be heard, so actively listen. And keep an open mind to what's being said. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is all about encouraging and developing a positive culture. So think about how you handle virtually when you need to speak with someone about their performance, and how can you best maximize their understanding and their engagement to the discussion. Other signs that may be helpful for employees is to avoid constantly checking your mobile phone at night out of work hours, minimizing chat at home, focus on what's going on elsewhere out of work. If you can find a hobby, I've started to teach myself to knit. It's interesting, but I will get there. Take a stroll, clear your head without feeling guilty, and start to create some exciting future plans, but don't put a date in them. You can add that later when we know more. Can we have the next slide, please? So what I wanted to do at the end of my session was to point you to further support that can be for managers and for employees. And there's lots of information out there. These are the ones that I read, and my personal opinion was they were very helpful, they were clear, very informative, and they had some rigor in their origins. There's an awful lot out there that I read and think, not really quite sure about this, but these are the ones that I've researched. So NHS, Mindful Manager, Mind, Rethink Mental Illness, great slides, and as useful for an employee as they are for the employer and managers. But what can Make UK do to help? Can we have the next slide, please? We offer support, as you'll know, in multi areas. Particularly, we have developed specific mental health and well-being support and products. And these could be delivered off the shelf, or they can be bespoke. So workplace wellbeing surveys, and these include the HSE 6 key stressors that Peter mentioned earlier. We can actually help you with evaluating the return on your wellbeing initiatives, developing relevant policies and procedures. And as I've already mentioned, if workplace relationships are a cause for concern and there are issues, then mediation can be a great way of getting the parties to speak within a safe, confidential environment, and it does reduce the number of grievances. We have the next slide, please. There's a range of courses that we do, and these are bespoke COVID-19 and or HSE and mental health. So if you are aware that you have a need, then do please speak with us, and they can be delivered via our virtual classroom. The next slide, please. We've also developed a suite of wellbeing documentations in a pack, and the feedback, the demand has been very high. The feedback has been very positive, that they've been helpful, useful, key resources. So I just thought I would show you what our Make UK Wellbeing document pack includes. And there's lots of hints, tips, guidance, and template documents. There's a guide for managers on how to initiate and hold a conversation on mental health, and a wellbeing plan of action that an employee actually populates and completes to help the conversation. And a lot of companies have fed back that they're now using that as part of their induction program, so that they're aware from day one of whether an employee needs additional support. Next slide, please. I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but I am going to take the opportunity to. It is important, and I learnt this myself, to seek help if it's needed. None of us are alone. There is help out there. Make UK want to support you, and please talk to us or seek support through your employee assistance program or wellbeing first aiders, and this was a general message to employees. And we must ensure that we all maintain regular contact with our teams and check for the status of their mental health and wellbeing. And the final slide, please. I've read many books, and these are the key ones. So there are useful, easy to read handbooks and guides. They're not full of technical psychological jargon, very useful hints and tips, easy to read, whether you're an employee, an individual who's looking at improving their mental health and well-being, or as a manager. And at Christmas, I was given Captain Tom Moore's autobiography. Wish I'd read that when I wasn't so well. It left me feeling renewed and refreshed. So a great read if you want to encourage yourself to have a positive perspective. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and I'll hand back to Chris. And I'm sorry that nothing worked my end.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire, and really conscious of time. Apologies and forgive me for the presentation. I could see Claire's slides perfectly. We will be sharing them if you're unable to see them at the beginning there, but hopefully we got through the sticky technical side of things, but actually some really informative guidance there, Claire, also for employers, and of course as ourselves as individuals and employees at the end of the day. So just to say, I think Claire's covered off how Make UK can help there. One last thing to mention is we are running our employment law update in March on the 16th, which will go through the last 6 months of case law on the most important topics at the moment in HR, and you're welcome to join. We will share a link for that to register as well. But of course, we'll send more information on all the things discussed this morning. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be able to help you. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope that was a real guidance for you and your businesses and your people, but actually some real practical tips in there as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully see you soon, and stay safe.
Thanks. Great session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.